Hello again, and welcome to another exciting episode of Social Studies. I'm going to try to keep this quick. I know I said that all the time, but I'm going to do my best. Okay, here we go. So we are focusing again, and just like the previous one, yesterday's, on this particular note sheet, the one that says revolution. We're not worried about this side today, about the declaration. We will do this later. We are focused, you should have filled in previously all the way up through Trenton, and we did not get to Saratoga. So we're doing the bottom part here. Okay, and if you missed something or if you need a copy of this note sheet, go to yesterday's, which would have been 3.20, and down at the bottom of that in Cami, there is a copy of this sheet. Okay, going on. One last thing to mention. So you may have noticed, I like to do things chronologically in order that they happened. We're getting a little bit off of that here just because of the way we are learning this year and doing stuff at home, and we're only in school for a short amount of time. So, for example, declaring independence. We need to talk about the Declaration of Independence more, the back of this sheet. We will be talking about it more. That happened on July 4th, 1776. Something important to remember is that happened during the war. We had been fighting the war for over a year when we declared independence, and the war would continue for, it depends on how you calculate, another 5 to 7 years after we declared independence. So we will be talking more about the Declaration of Independence later, but today we're going to go through and finish up the war, just the military aspects of the war that you're going to need to know. And then we're going to backtrack for the declaration. So just keep in mind, declaring independence was not before the war. It was not at the end of the war. It was in the middle of the war. Okay. It would have fit right in here between Bunker Hill and Trenton, basically. All right. Saratoga. And this is an important blank, blank, blank. I'm not going to just fill them in for you, but if you listen along, I will go in that order so you will know. Okay, Saratoga. Basically, the British were attempting to capture the Hudson River in order to divide New England from the rest of the colonies. This is an important patriot or American or colonies or continental army, whatever you want to call them, Yankee, whatever, victory. Major turning point of the war. I'll get to that in a second. Convinced France that the Americans might win the war, which led France to recognize U.S. independence, the first nation to do so, and decides to join the U.S., the Americans, as allies. So this is in the fall of 1777, more than a year after we have declared independence. Now, just because you declare independence does not necessarily make it so. If we don't win this war, we're not independent. And just because you say you're independent, what if no other country believes you? What if they don't recognize your independence? Be like, what if you claimed you were president, but nobody believed you? You're not president, all right? If you claim you're an independent country, but nobody believes you, doesn't make it so. So France is going to recognize us as a country, but not for more than a year, not until after this Battle of Saratoga. Saratoga is, again, New York State. You probably know this is the Hudson River right here. Henry Hudson from Holland sailed up the Hudson River. This was originally part of the New Netherlands colony. Albany's in this area right here. All right, anyways, the British up here, Canada, British colony under British control at this point after the French and Indian War. New York City, by this point, had been captured. So Long Island, New York City, down here, the bottom of the Hudson had been captured by the British. The British plan is this. They're going to send part of their army up the Hudson River and part of their army down from Canada through Lake Champlain, Lake George, and then march across to the Hudson River. And they are going to meet up, and they are effectively going to control all of this Hudson River Valley, cut New England. Remember, this part here is New England. They're going to cut New England off from the rest of the colonies. They think that's going to end the war. Okay, that's the plan. It doesn't quite go as planned because the British get defeated. They're unable to really get very far up the Hudson River, and they are defeated. The troops coming down are defeated at Saratoga. So Saratoga is a major turning point of the war. This is not the end of the war. It's called the turning point because before this time, there wasn't really not much realistic chance that these American colonies were going to win, even though the war just kept dragging on. Um, there were a lot of problems. Money sold, not enough money, not enough weapons, not enough ships, not enough guns, soldiers, everything. They were lacking in all that. And they were hoping that France would help us out. Why would France help us out? Well, as you know, France and England were always fighting one another during this time period. But there's a problem. Nobody wants to join a losing side. France doesn't want to get involved in a war that they have no chance of winning. So they want some evidence here that these Americans, these colonists, really have a shot of defeating the British. Now we'll talk about how we send Ben Franklin and John Adams over to try to help sway the French. But what really sways them or convinces them is this American victory at Saratoga. They capture, I don't remember the number off the top of my head, thousands of British soldiers are captured and taken prisoner. This is not the end of the war, as I said. The war keeps going, but it's a turning point. Oh, if you're doing creative notes here, now I'm not going to require them, I don't think, for this part. But if you do the creative notes, I will allow them to be used on the test most likely. So you might be in your interest. This is how I would do Saratoga. See how it's an S with turns in it, a turning point, major turning point. Huge American victory prevents the French from cutting New England off by capturing the Hudson River and convinces France to join as allies. Major turning point, Saratoga. Okay. Moving on, that winter, the winter of 1777-78, I should point out here that during this time period, for the most part, with some exceptions, as you remember, Washington crossing the Delaware on Christmas of 1776, that was the exception. For the most part, during the Revolutionary War, fighting came to a stop in the winter. It was just too hard for all the armies to travel, to fight. So they all basically just hunkered down for the winter. And in 1777 and 78, the British Army, by this time, had pretty much captured Philadelphia. They are staying in Philadelphia. By the way, what about the Continental Congress? Well, they had moved out of Philadelphia and were kind of on the run, meeting in various cities at this point. Valley Forge is a valley located near Philadelphia. I think it's about, I'm not sure, 19 miles sticks out in my head. I'm not sure if that's right, from the center of Philadelphia, but it's in the Philadelphia area. Close enough to keep an eye on the British, not so close that they're going to be in super danger. The Washington and the Continental Army get a late start rolling into Valley Forge for the winter. They choose this spot. There's nothing. Well, there is this house for Washington to stay at, but for the most part, it's wilderness area, which thousands of Continental Army soldiers have to, originally staying in tents, but they have to quickly cut down trees and build all of these cabins. They build, I don't remember the number, but a couple hundred of these cabins to live in. Now, these are not heated or insulated or anything like that. It's a rough winter. Also, by this time, there's shortages of everything because the Continental Congress has no money to buy supplies, etc. The people of Philadelphia and the other colonies who want to make money, they're running a business. For the most part, they are selling their supplies to the British. Kind of doesn't make sense, but not the most patriotic thing to do, but that's what's going on. Okay, so the Continental Army has a really, really rough time. One of the big shortages they have is boots. Nobody has shoes or boots. Many of the men have lost their shoes. They've worn out. They are literally barefoot throughout the winter. Frostbite is a huge problem. People are getting toes amputated, bleeding. They say they leave footprints, bloody footprints wherever they go. It's not a pretty sight. But as has been said, if it doesn't kill you, it makes you stronger. They spend this time, those who don't die, and many, many, many do die. Don't get me wrong. Lots of them die from disease and possibly starvation, at least not being malnourished, I should say. Um, Lots of the Continental Army dies, but those who did not die emerge stronger. And that's because they spend the winter training. And kind of like when you go through something tough, it sort of brings you closer together with the people you are going through it with. That kind of happens. They become a much more cohesive, like a real army. And as you can see, they just bundle up their feet. There's a person who comes over from Prussia, Baron von Steuben. Steuben County is named after him, by the way. He does not even speak English. He comes over here and volunteers to um, help train soldiers. And Washington gets to know him a little bit, trusts him enough, puts him in charge of training, and he really turns this Continental Army into an army, not just a bunch of farmers running around with guns. They kind of surprise the British when they emerge in the spring, knowing how to fight, and that's thanks to their man um, BVS Baron von Steuben. All right. Anyways, we don't need to know this right now. Valley Forge, not really a battle. Um, Washington troops send harsh winter in Valley Forge. Von Steuben trains the soldiers. They emerge tougher, more united, stronger, etc. You can pause here and take a look at this little artistic creative note. Notice how keywords are underlined to help you. Okay, moving on. By this point, we're moving forward, moving forward. Keep war drags on, drags on, drags on. We're skipping ahead to 1781. Um, by 1781, the war has shifted more down southward. The British Army has controlling more and more of this land. Washington and his men are they've kind of moved southward. They're down in the fighting is now down in Virginia. Now, by this point, France has joined the war and on the side of the Americans, and they have a navy, the French fleet, which is very helpful for the Americans. And what's going to end up happening at Yorktown is General Cornwallis, Lord Cornwallis, is leading his men down here towards Yorktown, where they are supposed to meet British ships who are going to transport them back up north. But the French fleet defeats the British out here at sea, and the British aren't able to come in to this Chesapeake Bay to save the soldiers, who are then followed up by Americans coming up behind them, and they're kind of trapped here. And Cornwallis is forced to surrender. At Yorktown, the British could not retreat, bottled up by Washington and the French fleet. The British surrendered, and finally we had won. This is in 1781. Cornwallis surrenders. Washington makes sure that his men are very polite and respectful to the British, doesn't want them to keep fighting. Now, the war won't officially end for a couple more years, but this is considered the last real fighting. This is really considered the end when Cornwallis surrenders, 1781. Supposedly the band played "The World Turned Upside Down," which "The World Turned Upside Down" was a song that, if you know Hamilton, you might know, and that is going to be your secret password to prove to me that you watched this video. So keep that in mind. The world turned upside down. This is news of it passing, some creative notes, and that's all we have for today. There is going to be another video for you to watch in the quiz. Make sure you fill in the notes and do the Google quiz. We'll get to that part later. So that is all I have for now. Sorry I went a little bit longer than I planned, but hopefully you learned something and enjoyed it.